I was coming back to my sister's after my wife's funeral. I found her tied to a chair. My nephew was dead. Everything ends sooner or later. The life of the woman I loved was over. We fought for a long time, but cancer was stronger. People talk about stages of grief like they're items on a checklist: denial, anger, bargaining, all that. At 70 years old, holding the empty hand of the only woman I ever loved, all I felt was a hollow so deep it swallowed sound. The priest's words blurred at the cemetery. Faces blurred. Even my own son's voice when he tried to help me down the wet grass slope felt like it was coming from another room. There was only one clear thought in my head as I watched them lower my wife into the ground. Now I only had Mary and Kyle, my sister and her boy, my last living pieces of family that I still trusted. Mary had diabetes and the heart of a stubborn teenager. She laughed it off, called it a little sugar problem. But I knew what those numbers on the glucometer meant. I'd sat with men in hospital waiting rooms back when I still worked maintenance in the city, watched wives pacing while doctors said words like neuropathy and ketoacidosis. So when I left the cemetery and drove back to Mary's house, our childhood house, the one she'd bought from my father's estate, my mind clung to that simple thought like a life raft. At least I still have Mary. At least I still have Kyle. As I drove up to the house, I noticed Kyle's car parked on the lawn by the front door. He must have been in a hurry to take care of his mother. She has diabetes, although the insulin should have lasted another week. That detail snagged in my mind in a way it shouldn't have. Kyle was neat to a fault. He ironed his shirts. He lined up his shoes. Parking on the lawn was something his father would have done, not him. The gravel crunched under my tires. The afternoon sky was that strange gray you only get on the day of a funeral, as if the world has agreed to dim itself out of respect. I killed the engine, sat there with both hands on the steering wheel for a second, and finally forced myself to move. That was when I saw the front door. Open. Just slightly. Just enough for a strip of darkness to show between the jamb and the frame. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Mary never left the door open. Not for anyone, not even for me. She locked it religiously, even when she was just stepping out to get the mail. Years of living with my worthless ex-brother-in-law had taught her at least that much. "Mary?" I called, my voice already tight. "It's me." No answer. I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The hallway smelled wrong. I couldn't place it at first. Something chemical, something sharp layered over the familiar scent of detergent and old furniture polish. I took one step and my shoe caught on something. The chair. Lying on its side in the hallway, one leg snapped clean off, a strip of duct tape still stuck to the backrest. My heart lurched into my throat. "Mary!" The house swallowed my voice. I moved faster than a 70-year-old man who buried his wife that morning should be able to move. My chest burned, my knees protested, but I stumbled down the hallway toward the kitchen because somewhere deep in my bones I already knew that was where the wrongness was centered. And then I saw it. Mary was taped to a chair in the middle of the kitchen. Gray duct tape wrapped around her wrists, her ankles, her chest. Her head hung down like that of a broken doll. One of her slippers had fallen off. Her toes were bluish, the nails too pale. A half-empty glass of water lay shattered on the floor next to a bottle of test strips. "Mary!" I rushed to her. She still had a pulse. Faint, thready, but there. "Mary, can you hear me? Mary, stay with me, do you hear me?" Her chin lolled to one side, exposing the bruises forming along her throat where the tape had rubbed the skin raw. Her breathing was shallow, a soft whistle escaping her lips every few seconds. I fumbled my phone out with shaking hands and dialed 911 while grabbing a knife from the drawer with my free hand and sawing at the tape. "What happened?" the operator asked. And in that moment I needed a second just to think of how to even name this situation. My sister had been tied up and left to die, and she's diabetic. Words felt useless, like flimsy tools against reality. "My sister," I finally managed. She's taped to a chair. She's diabetic. Her door was open. I just got here. She's unconscious. Breathing, but barely. Is she responsive? No. The knife slipped. My hand was sweating so badly I almost dropped it. No, she's out. Pulse is weak. Stay on the line, sir. Help is on the way. Do you have her medication there? Insulin. Test kit. The insulin, which should have lasted another week. Once I freed her, I laid her right down on the floor. Every second mattered now. The blood sugar test, where was it? And the insulin? In its usual place, it was gone. The little plastic case where she kept her pens was open and empty, thrown on the counter like trash. A cold, calm part of my brain took over, the same part that had gotten me through 15 years doing emergency repairs at night in the city. Panic later, it said. Move now. I've got an emergency supply in my car, I told the operator, already sprinting for the door. I'll test her. I'll give her a dose. Just get here. Running back in from the car, with practiced movements, I took a blood sample. Her sugar was through the roof. Insulin. Fast. I drew the dose with shaking hands, jabbed the pen into the soft flesh of her stomach, counted the seconds like I'd done with my wife so many times before chemo. Her breathing? The operator asked. I bent down. Good. Now to check her breathing. Barely noticeable, but still there. Shallow, I said, but there. Paramedics are 3 minutes out. Stay with her. Talk to her. So I talked. About nothing and everything. About our father's terrible jokes. About the time she'd broken her arm falling out of the apple tree and blamed me for pushing her, even though I'd been 3 blocks away. My voice trembled, but I kept going. Don't you dare leave me too, I whispered into her ear. You hear me, Mary? Not today. Not like this. 3 minutes stretched into an eternity. When the ambulance finally howled into the quiet street, I all but dragged the paramedics inside. They slid around me like water, efficient and focused. Oxygen mask, IV, monitors. Numbers flashed across their equipment, telling a story of a body on the edge of shutting down. She's in DKA, one of them muttered. Let's move. Sir, are you coming with us? Another asked. I looked around the kitchen once, at the broken chair, the empty insulin case, the tiny smear of blood on the linoleum where Mary's wrist had scraped against the tape, and something inside me settled into a hard, cold shape. I'll follow in my car, I said. But, call the police. Someone did this to her. He met my eyes for a second and nodded. We will. They took her. The red doors of the ambulance swallowed her up, and then she was gone in a blur of color and siren. I stood there on the front lawn like an old scarecrow, suit jacket flapping in the wind, my black funeral tie hanging crooked, my wife in the ground, my sister in the hands of strangers, and somewhere, my nephew Kyle. Where the hell was Kyle? At the hospital, time lost shape. They took Mary straight into ICU. White coats came and went. Machines beeped and hummed behind heavy doors. A nurse gave me a form to fill out, and I stared at the question relationship to patient for so long she finally took the clipboard gently from my hands and filled it herself. When the doctor finally came out to talk to me, his face was tired, his hair pressed flat by a surgical cap he'd only just removed. She's in a coma, he said. Diabetic ketoacidosis, complicated by what looks like prolonged stress and hypoxia. We've stabilized her as best we can. How long? My voice sounded like someone else's. We don't know how long this will last. Please be patient. Be patient. My wife's oncologist had said the same thing while we waited for scans. I sat outside my sister's room in complete shock. People passed me in the corridor, orderlies pushing carts, nurses with clipboards, families with flowers and anxious faces. They blurred together. Where was Kyle? His phone was unreachable. He wasn't posting anything on social media. His car was at the house, abandoned like an accusation on the front lawn. Where could he have gone? Thoughts were swarming, 1,000 questions in my head. What had happened? Who could have done this? Sir, sir! Someone was trying to get my attention. A hand touched my shoulder. Are you all right? Do you need any help? I blinked and looked up. The man in front of me was in his 40s with a face that had seen too many bad nights and too little sleep. Dark suit, loosened tie, a leather notebook in one hand. A badge hung from his belt. No, I'm fine, I answered, coming back to my senses. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. I'm Detective Harris. We got the call about your sister. I'm sorry about your wife, too. The officer at the scene said you just buried her today. I stared at him. Is there some rule in the universe that says everything has to fall apart at once? He didn't try to answer that. Smart man. Can we talk? He asked instead. I know it's a bad time, but the sooner we understand what happened, the better the chances of finding whoever did this. Whoever did this. The phrase sat oddly in my ears. I wanted to say, this is some mistake. A stranger broke in. A robbery. Wrong house. But Kyle's car on the lawn kept flashing in my mind like a warning light. Together we went back to my sister's house. The kitchen looked worse in daylight. They'd turned on all the lights for forensics, and now every stain, every scuff mark, every piece of broken glass stood out in harsh detail. Yellow numbered markers dotted the floor. Do you see anything missing? Harris asked. Besides the insulin you told the paramedics about? Mary's little world was not complex. A few framed photos on the walls. The ceramic rooster she'd insisted on buying at a flea market 15 years ago. A pile of unopened mail on the hallway table. But the more we looked, the more wrong things we found. Her purse lay open on the counter, wallet empty. Desk drawers in her small home office had been rummaged through, papers scattered. It was there, in that tiny office off the kitchen, that I found the first hint this wasn't just some junkie breaking in for quick cash. A folder lay open on the desk. Inside were recent bank statements, or rather, photocopies of them. The original envelopes were nowhere to be seen. I scanned the numbers, my old maintenance man's brain switching over to the careful arithmetic that had kept me out of debt my whole life. Something didn't add up. Her checking account, 0. Savings, 0. Investment account, empty. Instead, at the bottom of each statement, a line, transfer to account, 44444-7893-Bahamas. All within the past 3 days. All for exact amounts that matched her balances down to the last cent. My throat went dry. Detective, I said slowly, you need to see this. He read the papers, his frown deepening. Do you know this account? No? We'll get a trace going through financial crimes. He flipped through more pages. This isn't some kid looking for pill money. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. We weren't a poor family. My father had left us that house and a bit of land. I'd worked my whole life. My late wife had been careful with what she'd saved from her teaching job. Mary had remarried well the second time. We had money, but to transfer everything down to the last cent to God knows where. Together with the detective, over the next few days, we found out that someone had forced my sister to sign a power of attorney. The papers were neat, properly notarized. Her signature was shaky, but it was hers. I could see the way she always looped the M in Mary, the same way she had when we were children and she practiced on school notebooks. Only this time, under duress. All the money went to some account in a Caribbean bank. And the fact that Kyle had disappeared, everything pointed to him being the one who had done this horrible thing. His car at the house, his work uniform folded neatly on his bed upstairs, as if he'd taken care not to wrinkle it before walking out to ruin his mother's life. There was no sign of a struggle in his room, no blood, no overturned chair, just absence. Although as long as Mary was in a coma, we had no way to know for sure. The first night after the attack, I slept in a plastic chair in the hospital corridor, my funeral suit jacket balled up under my head. Mary lay behind the glass, tubes in her arms, machines whispering around her. At 3 in the morning, when the hall was empty and the vending machine at the end of the corridor hummed like a lonely planet, the question finally formed clearly in my mind. What if Kyle really did it? I had helped raise that boy. After Mary's second husband died of a heart attack, I'd been the one teaching Kyle to drive, helping him with homework, taking him fishing when his mother was too tired. He'd always been a bit restless. Fell in with the wrong crowd once or twice, but nothing serious. Some spray paint on the underpass when he was 16. A few fights behind the school. I'd sat with him in the principal's office, listened to the speeches about direction and discipline. But he'd straightened out, got a job at the garage, helped his mother with her meds. Or so I thought. By the second day, Detective Harris had his people tracing the money. Evidently, the account in the Bahamas belonged to a shell company. They got warrants. They dug. They brought in a specialist from financial crimes. 2 more days passed. Mary's condition was stable but unchanged. On the 5th day, I went back to Mary's house alone. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I stared at the kitchen long enough, it would give me answers. The police had done their sweep. The chair she'd been tied to was gone, tagged as evidence. The tape residue still clung to the floor. I walked through the rooms like a ghost, past the family photos on the wall, the 3 of them smiling at some beach. Mary with her diabetes bracelet glinting on her wrist. Kyle with his arm around her shoulders, looking like a good kid. In his room, I opened the closet. Shirts on hangers, an old football, a shoebox on the top shelf with a stack of worn-out video game cases, and a second shoebox behind those. Inside were things that did not belong to the boy I thought I knew. A roll of $100 bills bound with an elastic band, cheap gold chains, a knife with a blackened blade, a photograph of Kyle with 3 other young men in hoodies, their faces half hidden, middle fingers extended toward the camera. On the back, in scrawled handwriting, family, blood in, blood out. V. V. My stomach clenched. There was only one person in our lives whose name started with V and made my skin crawl. Mary's first husband, Vincent, a drunk, a bully, a man who never worked but always had money. He'd been Vince the man back then to his friends, Vince the parasite to me. Mary had married him at 22, long before Kyle. By the time she realized what he really was, it was too late. He sold her jewelry, spent her paychecks, broke her arm once. He disappeared after she finally threw him out. A messy divorce, a restraining order. Then nothing. Not a word for years. I had thought he was gone from our lives forever. Now his shadow was sitting in my nephew's closet staring up at me from the back of a cheap photograph. I took the shoebox straight to Harris. He looked at the picture, then at me. "Who's V?" "Vince," I said. "Mary's ex-husband. If he's involved in this, he didn't do it for the money. He did it to hurt her." Harris nodded slowly. "Do you know where he is now?" "No." "Well," he said, "we'll find him. But first, we find Kyle." It took a week to find Kyle. A week of dead ends, of leads called in and discarded. Some girl at a club said she'd seen him 2 nights ago. A neighbor claimed he'd heard shouting from Mary's house 3 days before the attack. Someone else said Kyle had been hanging around with those boys from the flats, whatever that meant. The only constant was that Kyle was missing, and the longer he stayed missing, the harder it was for me to imagine a version of this story where he was innocent. On the 8th day, I was at the hospital sitting by Mary's bed and reading her the newspaper. Not because she could hear me, though they said sometimes comatose patients can, but because I needed to pretend life hadn't collapsed into a single crime scene. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. "Hello? Mr. Wilson?" It was Harris. "We've got him." My heart slammed against my ribs. "Kyle?" "We picked him up downtown. He's at the precinct. If you want to see him, this is your chance before we transfer him." My mouth went dry. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. I looked at Mary. The ventilator hissed softly, forcing air into lungs that had once yelled at me for stealing her favorite cookie from the jar. "I'm going to see your son," I said. "I don't know if I'm going to hug him or kill him, but I'm going." When I saw him in handcuffs, rage took over. They brought him into the interview room in shackles, wrists chained to a metal ring on the table, ankles bound. He looked thinner. There was a bruise on his cheekbone and a cut on his lip, like someone had already given him the welcome to jail greeting. But it was his eyes that did it. He looked straight at me with a kind of detached amusement, like I was some stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. I walked up and punched him in the face. My knuckles exploded with pain. His head snapped to the side, blood spraying from his already split lip. The officer by the door just glanced at me approvingly, though out loud he said, "He'll get what's coming to him. Don't touch him." Kyle spat blood onto the concrete floor and looked me straight in the eyes. "She wouldn't have lasted long anyway," he said, his voice flat. "And I need the money more." The words slammed into me harder than any punch. For a moment the room went white around the edges. At that, I lunged at him again, but the officers held me back this time. My chest heaved. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might burst. "Why?" I shouted. "She's your mother." He shrugged, as much as anyone in cuffs could shrug. "I never asked to be born." It turned out Kyle had gotten involved with some street gang. Not one of those movie ones with matching jackets and theme songs. The real kind. The kind that carved their territory into the city inch by inch. He kept talking about some code of honor, about how the gang was his family now. Words that were not his, phrases he'd borrowed from someone else. Someone had really messed with the kid's head. Harris sat across from him, watching silently, letting him dig his own grave. Beside him, a recorder blinked its unblinking red eye. "And the power of attorney?" Harris asked finally. "That was your idea?" Kyle smirked. "Old lady liked to sign papers. I helped her." "The transfers," Harris said. "You knew where the money was going? Does it matter?" "Yes." Kyle leaned back as far as the cuffs would let him, the metal scraping softly against the tabletop. "I got my cut. That's what matters." His performance was almost impressive. Cool, detached, heartless. Almost. You could see the act was hard for Kyle to keep up. The muscles in his jaw kept twitching. He wanted to look confident, but his behavior gave him away. He was on the verge of breaking down. After an hour of this, Harris stood. "All right, Kyle. We're done for now." "What, no plea deal?" Kyle sneered. "Not yet," Harris said. "We'll see how you enjoy county tonight." They took Kyle back to holding. I stood in the corridor outside the interview room, my hands still throbbing from that punch. "He's guilty," I said. "You heard him." Harris nodded slowly. "He wants us to think that, but his story doesn't fit half of what we've found. He doesn't know enough about the details. Somebody else planned this." "Vince," I said. "Maybe." "Then why not go straight after him?" Harris looked tired. "Because right now, your nephew is the one we have in custody. He's the one with blood on his hands, figuratively, if not literally. And if he keeps his mouth shut, your ex-brother-in-law walks away with everything." "He won't keep his mouth shut," I said. "He's not that strong." Harris glanced at me. "You think so?" "I helped raise that boy," I said. "I know his tells. He's lying even to himself." Hours later they invited me in to talk to him again. Harris's idea. "Sometimes," he said, "they'll talk to a family member when they won't talk to us. Just don't promise him anything we can't deliver." Kyle sat in the corner of the small concrete cell, knees drawn up, his cuffed hands resting on top of them. The earlier bravado was gone. His shoulders shook. His face was wet. "I didn't want to," he screamed as soon as he saw me. "They made me." I closed the cell door behind me, the heavy metal clang ringing in my chest. "Who made you?" He squeezed his eyes shut. "You're going to hate me." I already do, I said. The words came out harsher than I intended. That doesn't mean I don't want the truth. He looked up, flinching at the honesty. Then something inside him crumpled. Them, he said. The boys, the crew, and him. Who? He swallowed. Vince. My stomach turned. Even after all these years, hearing that name in connection with my sister made something cold crawl up my spine. Start at the beginning, I said. It came out in broken pieces, between sobs and sniffling breaths. How he'd met one of the gang boys at the garage when a car came in with bullet holes in the side and no questions asked. How they'd invited him out for drinks. How they'd made him feel like he belonged. He said he knew Mom, Kyle whispered. Said he'd known her since she was my age. Said she'd betrayed him. That she'd taken everything from him. That he'd watched her play family with another man while he rotted. He said I owed him. And you believed him? I asked. He flinched. You weren't there when Mom talked about him. She never mentioned his name, but I could tell. The way she went quiet. The way she looked out the window. I wanted to know what he'd done. He told me his side. It sounded different. He sounded like a victim. He was a master at that, I thought grimly, even back then, turning every abuse into a sob story about his rough childhood, his bad luck. He started small, Kyle continued. Asked me to run errands, deliver cash, pick up packages. Said he'd pay me more than the garage ever would. And you liked the money. He nodded miserably. Mom's insulin is expensive. The insurance doesn't cover everything. I thought, if I could help. Of course he'd tell himself that. Even monsters have to sleep at night. Then he told me about the plan, Kyle said. His voice dropped lower. He said Mom owed him. That you all owed him. Said she got this house because of him. That she got her life because of him. That she'd taken years from him and he was just taking them back, with interest. I clenched my fists. The power of attorney. He nodded. He said he needed it to stabilize assets, whatever that means. Said the laws had changed and Mom had to sign anyway or she'd lose everything in taxes. He had the papers. He had this lawyer guy with him. Where? At the house. When I got home that night, he was sitting in our kitchen like he'd always belonged there. Mom almost fainted when she saw him. I could picture it. Mary's hands going to her face. The way her shoulders would have tightened. She refused at first, Kyle whispered. Started yelling. Told him to get out. That's when he showed her the pictures. What pictures? Of me, he said softly. With them. With the gang. Delivering stuff. He said if she didn't sign, he'd go to the police. A concerned citizen just trying to protect the community from a dangerous young criminal. He said they'd put me away for years. He knew. He knew she'd do anything to keep me out of prison. And you just stood there? I asked. He flinched again. I told her to sign. I told her it was okay. That it was just temporary, just paperwork. I lied. I knew it wasn't just paperwork. But I was scared. Scared for yourself? Yes. The honesty in his voice hurt worse than another lie would have. She signed, he whispered. Her hands were shaking so hard the pen almost fell. Then he took the papers, smiled, and left. He told me to stay, said we had more to do. The next day, I said slowly, I found her tied to a chair. He broke then. Completely. Sobs tore out of his chest, ugly and raw. He came back, Kyle choked. He said the bank transfers were done. He'd cleaned out everything, her accounts, the investments, everything. Said it was his alimony. Mom started yelling again. She grabbed the phone, said she was calling the police. He grabbed her, hit her. I tried to pull him off, but he slammed me into the wall. He told me to tie her up or he'd make me watch him choke her to death. My hands shook. So you tied your own mother to a chair. I thought he'd leave her there for an hour, just to scare her. That's what he said. Just long enough to teach her a lesson. But he took her insulin. He took everything. He told me if I called anyone, if I untied her, if I even looked at a phone, he'd know. He said he had people watching. And you believed him? He nodded miserably. He said I had to disappear for a while until it blew over, that I'd get my cut later. Said if Mom died, well, that was on her. She should have behaved. His words, not mine. I stared at my nephew, at this boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during fishing trips. What about what you said earlier? I asked quietly. About needing the money more than your mother? He winced. He told me what to say, if I got caught. He said there's nothing cops hate more than an ungrateful kid. Said if I acted like I didn't care, they'd stop looking for anyone else. He said, he took a shuddering breath. He said he'd be listening, that if I gave him up, they'd fish me out of a river with my tongue cut out. Or they'd leave you in a ditch. Or... He couldn't finish. It was all very Vince. Threats that were specific enough to lodge in the brain. I sat down on the narrow bunk across from him, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. You had a choice, I said. I know. You chose him. I know. He buried his face in his chained hands. I didn't want to, he whispered again. They made me. Then came the trial. I didn't even attend at first. The prosecutor explained it all in a monotone in his office, setting out the plea deal like a menu. Your nephew is cooperating, he said. He's agreed to testify against Vincent and the others. With his statement and the financial records, we can tie your ex-brother-in-law to half a dozen frauds, 2 assaults, and at least 1 suspicious overdose we're looking at. We can get him off the street for a long time. And Kyle? I asked. He's no angel, the prosecutor said. He tied your sister to a chair and left her there. But he's also young, no priors of this magnitude, and he's the only person willing to talk. We're recommending 8 years, with possible parole after 3 for good behavior. 3 years. 3 years for betraying his own mother. The math of justice has never made sense to me. I worked 40 years to keep my family housed and fed, and there was no early parole from that. I stayed with Mary. She lay in that hospital bed for 14 days before she opened her eyes. On the morning she woke up, I was half asleep in the chair by her bed, my chin on my chest, my hand still wrapped around her fingers. Her voice was barely a whisper. Where's my boy? I jerked awake. For a second I thought I was dreaming, that it was my wife's voice, lost in time. Mary? Her eyes found mine. The machines beeped faster, like they recognized her too. She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. Easy, I said, pressing a hand to her shoulder. You've been out. How long? 2 weeks. Her eyes widened. Kyle? I swallowed. He's safe. She searched my face. I've never been able to lie to my sister. Not really. What did he do? She asked quietly. So I told her. Not all of it. Not the details about the money. Not the part where he'd shrugged and said she wouldn't have lasted long anyway. Just enough. He signed with them. He helped Vince. He tied her. He left. She listened without interrupting, tears sliding slowly down her temples into her hair. He was scared, she said when I finished. That doesn't excuse it. No, she agreed, but it explains it. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were clearer. He's my son, she said simply. I forgive him. I stared at her. Just like that? Not just like that, she said. I'll remember every second I spent in that chair. I'll remember the way my chest felt when I couldn't breathe. I'll remember being more afraid for him going to prison than for myself dying. But yes, I forgive him. And Vince? A shadow passed over her face. "I will never forgive him," she said. Good, I thought, because neither will I. The second act of this story should have ended there. The bad man in handcuffs. The young fool going to prison with a chance to make something of himself afterward. The mother alive, if not whole. But life doesn't care about the structure of stories. 3 months after Kyle's sentencing, Mary came home. She moved slowly, her joints stiff, her hands weakened. The coma had taken things from her that would never come back. But she was alive. We sold some of her furniture to pay legal fees. My wife's life insurance, small as it was, went toward clearing some of Mary's debts. The bank managed to recover a fraction of the stolen money. The rest was gone, melted into the offshore maze Vince had set up. I thought my part in all this was over. Then, one rainy afternoon in November, I got a letter. No return address, just my name, written in a hand I hadn't seen in nearly 30 years. Vincent's. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Old man," it read. "Congratulations, you won. For now, don't get too comfortable. Boys like Kyle always come home to real family eventually. Blood in, blood out. V." My hands trembled around the page. Underneath his signature was something else. A small, crude drawing of a chair and a strip of tape. It was meant to rattle me, to remind me he still existed, even behind bars. Instead, it did something else. It reminded me that my story with him wasn't finished. That was the second hook, the moment I realized this wasn't just about surviving what he'd already done. It was about making sure he could never hurt anyone again. People assume revenge is some fiery, impulsive thing. In my experience, it's slow, patient. I didn't go down to the prison and scream at him through the glass. I didn't send threatening letters back. I did something much quieter. I went to the library. I read about financial fraud cases, about asset forfeiture, about how victims can file civil suits even while a criminal case is in progress. I talked to the detective from Financial Crimes, a woman named Morales who wore tired eyes and sharp suits. "This is personal for you," she said after I finished explaining what I wanted. "Yes. You understand he might not have anything left. Guys like that burn through money like paper." "I don't want his money," I said. "I want his peace." She studied me. "You're not talking about anything outside the law, are you, Mr. Wilson?" I held her gaze. "I've spent 70 years following rules I didn't write. I've never hit anyone except my own nephew, and even that I'm not sure I regret. I'm not asking you to break the law. I'm asking you to apply it, thoroughly." Her mouth twitched in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Well then," she said, "let's be thorough." We dug. Vince had been busy over the years. There were other women like Mary, other bank accounts, other power of attorney schemes, elderly men forced to sign documents they barely understood, frail women whose savings vanished days before they suffered accidents that looked a lot like negligence at best and attempted murder at worst. The more we found, the more prosecutors wanted to talk to me. Not because I was a legal mastermind, I'm a retired maintenance guy, but because I knew how Vince thought. He never did the work himself, I told them. There's always a kid, some desperate boy who thinks he owes him everything. That's who you need to look for. They did. They found 3 more young men like Kyle. 2 were already in prison on unrelated charges. 1 was in rehab. All of them were scared of Vince. All of them thought he'd reach them even from behind bars. One by one they flipped. The new cases didn't change Kyle's sentence. His deal was already inked. But they did something else. They turned Vince from a small-time con with a couple of charges into a serial predator with a pattern the courts could no longer ignore. At his sentencing hearing, I sat in the back of the courtroom. Mary stayed home. She said if she saw him, she'd rip out his throat with her bare hands. I believed her. Vince shuffled in, shackled, older and heavier. His hair thinner, but his eyes still full of that mocking light I remembered from the day he'd first shown up at our father's door to take my sister away. He scanned the room and found me. His lips curled. I didn't look away. The judge read out the charges: fraud, assault, attempted murder, RICO. Words piled up like bricks. Years piled up with them. 20, 30, 40. Vince's smirk faltered. When the judge finally said, "This court sentences you to 60 years without possibility of parole," the room exhaled. He turned his head toward me one last time. His lips moved. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read them well enough. This isn't over. Maybe not. But for the first time since my wife died, I felt something like balance click into place. Justice is never perfect. It leaks around the edges. But this was close enough. Kyle served 2.5 years of his 3-year sentence. Good behavior. Cooperation. Classes taken. Programs completed. He wrote Mary letters from prison. Long ones at first, apologizing over and over, telling her about the counseling group he'd joined, the chaplain he talked to, the way he'd started reading the Bible not as a joke, but as something to hold on to. Mary wrote back every week. She told him about her physical therapy, about the way her legs trembled when she stood for the first time without support, about the recipes she was trying with low sugar. I read her letters once when she left them on the table. They were full of hope in a way I didn't have the courage to feel. He wrote to me too, 3 times. The first letter was full of anger, at himself, at Vince, at me for letting them send him away even though he'd helped us. I didn't answer. The second was shorter, just an update. "Mom says you're taking care of her. Thank you." Nothing more. I didn't answer that one either. The third was the one I still keep in a drawer I rarely open. "Uncle Jim," it began. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know if I'd forgive me either, if I were you. But I need you to know something. That day when I tied Mom to the chair, I thought I had more time. I thought I could come back. I was a coward. I chose myself. But if Mom had died, it would have killed me too. I wake up every night thinking I'm still in that kitchen. I know what I did. I know what it makes me. I'm trying to be someone else now. The chaplain says God forgives everything. I don't know. But I hope one day you will at least believe I'm trying. Kyle." I read it 5 times. Then I closed the drawer. The day he was released, Mary asked me to drive her to the prison. She wore a dress she hadn't worn since before the coma. It hung looser on her, but she'd insisted. "My boy is coming home," she said. "I'm not meeting him in sweatpants." On the way, she stared out the window. "You don't have to come in," she said quietly, "if you don't want to." "I'm here," I said. "But you're not really." She was right. We pulled up to the gate. Men in uniform. Fences topped with coils of razor wire. A few women waiting near the entrance clutching plastic bags of belongings and bouquets of cheap flowers. Kyle walked out with a cardboard box in his hands. He looked older, thinner. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he saw Mary, his face broke open in a way I'd never seen as an adult. Raw, unguarded. He dropped the box and ran. They met halfway. She threw her arms around him, her legs buckling. He caught her. They clung to each other, both sobbing. I stood by the car, hands in my pockets, watching. After a long moment, Kyle lifted his head. His eyes met mine over Mary's shoulder. "Uncle Jim," he said. His voice broke on the second word. The last time he'd said my name, he'd been in cuffs, spitting blood onto a concrete floor. Now it was barely more than a whisper. I nodded once. He let go of Mary and walked over to me slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything," he said, stopping a few feet away. "But I need to say this." "You've written plenty," I said. "Words on paper aren't the same as standing here," he said, "looking at you." He took a breath. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I chose him. I'm sorry I tied her up. I'm sorry I took your last day with Aunt Linda and turned it into a nightmare. I'm sorry I made you think your family was worse than the cancer that took her. I'm sorry for all of it." Mary stood beside him, her hand on his arm, as if she could somehow buffer him from whatever I might say. "I'm going to seminary," he blurted, words tumbling out. "The chaplain helped me apply. I want to be a pastor. I know you probably think that's ridiculous, a guy like me preaching to others, but it's the only way I can think of to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I've done. Mom says that's a good thing." "She would," I said softly. He flinched. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I hope that one day when you think of me, you'll remember something other than that chair." Silence stretched between us. Behind Kyle, the prison loomed. Ahead of us, the road leading back to Mary's small house. "Do you remember the day at the lake?" I asked suddenly. He blinked. "What?" "You were 11, I said. "You insisted on baiting your own hook. You fell into the water, came up gasping, crying, yelling that the fish had grabbed your foot and tried to drag you down." He stared at me, then let out a strangled sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "You said I was too skinny for any fish to bother eating." "You made me promise never to tell your friends you cried," I said. He wiped at his eyes. "You promised." "I kept that promise," I said. "I've kept a lot of promises." "I know," he whispered. "And I made another one," I said. "To who?" "To myself," I said. "The day I walked into that kitchen and saw your mother tied to that chair, I made myself a promise. That whatever else happened, however long she lived, I would never again close my eyes to the truth about the people I love, not even to protect myself from pain." He swallowed. "The truth," I said, "is that the boy I took fishing, the boy who cried at the lake, he died in that kitchen." Mary's breath hitched. "You're not him anymore," I continued. "You're something else. Maybe better. Maybe worse. Time will tell. But for me, the nephew I loved like a son is gone." He flinched as if I'd hit him. "I understand," he said hoarsely. "I'll still come by to help Mom. I'll still call. You don't have to talk to me. Thank you for being honest." He turned slightly, squaring his shoulders, preparing to walk away. "However," I added. He stopped. "The man you're trying to become," I said. "The one who wrote those letters, who faced what he did instead of hiding behind Vince's shadow. I don't know him yet. I don't owe him anything. He hasn't earned my love, but I won't get in his way." He turned back toward me slowly. "That's more than I deserve," he whispered. "Probably," I said. We stood there for a moment longer, 3 damaged people in a prison parking lot, the rain starting to fall in fine, cold drops around us. "Come on," Mary said finally, her voice trembling but firm. "Let's go home." Life gradually got back on track, if you looked from far away anyway. Mary moved more slowly, but she laughed again. She started knitting in the evenings, something our mother had never been able to teach her properly when we were young. Kyle visited twice a week. He helped her with the groceries, fixed things around the house, took her to church. He moved into the seminary dorms at the edge of town, his days full of classes and prayers and work-study hours. He decided to become a pastor and went off to study in seminary. That was how he chose to atone for his sins. His mother forgave him. She went to every service he preached as a student, even those awful early ones where his voice shook and he lost his place and his sermon notes fell to the floor. I went to exactly one. I sat in the back near the door just in case I needed to leave. He preached about forgiveness, about Peter denying Christ 3 times, about how some betrayals feel unforgivable, and yet grace still exists. His voice was steady now. His eyes didn't avoid the corners of the room where I sat. At the end of the sermon, people lined up to shake his hand. I slipped out before he could see me. Outside, the air was crisp. The sky was clear. I stood there for a long moment, watching my breath. Vince was never getting out of prison. He'd die there, surrounded by concrete and steel and men who owed him nothing. The chair he'd ordered my sister tied to had become the instrument of his ruin. Kyle would spend the rest of his life trying to be better than the boy who'd listened to him. Mary would keep loving him no matter what, because that is what mothers do. As for me, when I walked into my sister's kitchen that day, I thought my nephew was dead. He wasn't. His heart was still beating. His lungs were still filling with air, but something in him had died. Something that no court, no chaplain, no seminary could resurrect. And standing there outside that little church, with my wife in the ground and my sister alive because I'd found her in time, I realized something simple and immovable. The world could forgive Kyle. God could forgive Kyle. His mother certainly had. But for me, he's dead. And sometimes that is the only kind of justice a man like me can live with.
My grandpa's worst really happened. I believe him. If you want more true tales stories like this, hit subscribe.